My name is Marin, and I'm 34 years old. On the 4th of July, at my mother's house, my sister handed my son a piece of dessert she swore was safe, rolled her eyes when I asked a second time to be sure, and told the whole backyard that I'd turned an allergy into my entire personality. 2 minutes later, I was the only person in that yard who knew exactly what was happening to my son and exactly what to do about it, because for 11 years, while my family treated my job like it was barely a job at all, I had been the charge nurse running trauma call in the busiest emergency room in the county. They found that out the same afternoon. They found out how wrong they'd been about everything else. Before I go on, tell me what time it is where you are right now and where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. I've been the responsible one in my family since I was about 9 years old, which is roughly the age my sister Kayla stopped having to be. Kayla is 2 years older than me and has always been the kind of beautiful that makes rooms rearrange themselves around her. She runs a small home styling business now, all soft linen and dried florals and captions about trusting the process. And my mother, Diane, has never once introduced her without adding what she does, the way you'd announce a title. When Diane introduces me, it's just my daughter Marin. Not the nurse, not the one who's run codes on strangers at 3 in the morning for 11 years straight. Just Marin. Eli is 4. He was diagnosed with a peanut allergy at 18 months, the anaphylactic kind, confirmed by an allergist after a first reaction that put him in the same emergency room I work in, on the other side of the gurney for once, watching someone else do the job I do every day. Since then, I've carried 2 epinephrine auto-injectors everywhere I take him, read every label twice, called ahead to restaurants, and asked the same handful of questions at every single family gathering for 2.5 years. My family started rolling their eyes at the questions sometime around year 1. My mother forgot to check a marinade at a smaller cookout 2 summers ago, a near miss, no reaction, just a very fast conversation with a waiter, and a very long car ride home in silence. Kayla, more than once, has said some version of the same thing, usually with a laugh underneath it to soften the edges. Some of us don't need a manual to raise a kid. What none of them ever said out loud, though everyone in that family quietly understood, was that for the last 3 years my husband Josh and I have been covering the $290 a month my mother's part-time job doesn't reach on her health insurance premium. Nobody talks about that at the table. Diane calls it, Marin likes to stay involved. I let her call it that because the alternative was making my mother say a much harder sentence out loud in front of everyone, and I never once needed her gratitude. I just needed, on one particular Saturday, for her to actually listen to me for 90 seconds. That turned out to be the one thing none of them were willing to give me. There's a specific afternoon, about a year before any of this, that I think about more than most. Eli had a mild reaction at my parents' house. Hives only, no breathing involvement, resolved in 20 minutes with an antihistamine and some quiet observation. I documented it anyway, out of habit, the same way I document everything at work: time, trigger, response, resolution. When I mentioned it to my mother a few days later, just to ask her to double-check a snack mix before our next visit, she told me I was keeping a chart on my own family like they were patients, and that it made everyone uncomfortable. Kayla's son, Tucker, is exactly Eli's age and has never had so much as a seasonal allergy in his life, and if I'm honest, I think that's some of where this really comes from. Kayla genuinely doesn't understand what she's never had to think about. It's just easier for everyone if my carefulness gets treated like a personality flaw instead of what it actually is. My father mostly stays out of all of it, the way he stays out of most things that aren't directly in front of him at that exact moment. A kind, distracted man who has spent 30-some years letting my mother run the emotional weather of that house. Growing up, I was the one who kept track of things, whether the stove got left on, whether Kayla had actually turned in her permission slip, whether anyone had checked on our grandmother after her hip surgery. Kayla used to call me the worry gene, half affectionate and half not, and somehow it followed me straight into adulthood with a more official job title stapled to it. I used to think becoming a nurse would finally translate all that watchfulness into something people respected. Mostly it just gave everyone a shorter, more specific word to roll their eyes at. The 4th of July cookout was at my parents' house, same as every year. Sparklers in mason jars down the porch railing, a cooler of drinks sweating in the shade, my father at the grill pretending he knew what he was doing with the ribs. My mother met us at the door and, before she'd even said hello to Eli, reminded me not to make today complicated. I told her I had absolutely no intention of doing that. I had no idea yet exactly how wrong that promise was about to turn out to be. For the first hour or so, it was easy. Eli chasing sparkler smoke around the yard with Tucker, Josh debating grilling technique with my father, my mother holding court about her tomato plants. At some point, my Aunt Carol asked, not unkindly, whether it was exhausting, always being the one who had to think about everything Eli couldn't eat. I told her it wasn't exhausting so much as automatic at this point, the same way locking your car door is automatic. My mother, passing behind us with a tray of deviled eggs, said lightly, "Well, we all just try to enjoy the day, don't we?" in the specific tone she uses when she wants a subject closed before it's actually finished being said. I let it close. I always let it close. That, I understand now, was the last easy hour of the entire afternoon. Kayla arrived late, the way she always does, carrying a glass dish covered in foil like she was delivering a trophy. "I made dessert," she announced to the yard, setting it down on the folding table like a small ceremony. "Same recipe as always. Don't worry, Marin, I know the drill." I asked anyway, because I always ask anyway. I walked over, kept my voice light, and said I just wanted to double-check there wasn't anything new in it before Eli had a piece. Kayla didn't even look up from arranging napkins. "It's literally the same icebox cake I always make. Relax." I asked again, gently, whether she'd added anything at all this time. A nut butter, a new topping, anything. That was when she straightened up, looked around the yard to make sure people were listening, and said the thing I'll be able to recite word for the rest of my life. "God, Marin, relax. You've turned this Allergy into your whole identity. He's a 4-year-old, not a liability. Let him live a little." A few cousins laughed the uncomfortable kind of laugh. My mother, standing right there with a stack of paper plates in her hands, said nothing at all. Not a word in my defense. Not a word asking Kayla to just double-check. Nothing. 11 years running a trauma floor, and in my own family, my medical opinion about my own son still carried less weight than my sister's mood at a barbecue. I gave in. I want to be honest about that, because it's the part I've turned over the most since. I was tired of being the difficult one at every single gathering, tired of the eye rolls, tired of watching my son's face when the grown-ups around him got that particular tight, impatient look. For one long moment, I actually considered just taking him inside instead, skipping dessert entirely, having the meltdown in private instead of the argument in public. I didn't. I told myself a 4-year-old deserved a piece of cake at a holiday cookout as much as any other kid at that table, and that I was allowed, just this once, to not be the person who ruined the moment. So when Kayla cut Eli a small piece, and he looked up at me, hopeful, holding his paper plate out with both hands the way 4-year-olds do, I let it go. I told myself I was being reasonable. I would spend the rest of that afternoon understanding exactly how wrong that word was. He'd taken 2 bites when I saw him scratch at his mouth. Not upset, not crying, just an itch, the kind that could have meant nothing. I was at his side within seconds anyway, because that itch is the very first thing they teach you to watch for, and I asked him to open his mouth for me. His lips had already started to swell, just slightly, just enough that only someone looking for it would have caught it that early. I said calmly that I needed my bag. Kayla, 3 feet away, actually laughed. "Don't you think you're overreacting again? He's fine. He's just being dramatic. He gets it from you." I didn't have time to argue with her. That was the last calm thought I had for almost 4 full minutes. By the time I got the bag from the porch, hives had bloomed across Eli's neck in blotchy red patches, and his cough had changed, gone from a normal kid's cough to something tighter, higher, with a small catching sound at the end of it that I have heard exactly this way from patients more times than I can count, and never once, until that day, from my own child. There's a sound the airway makes right before it starts to genuinely close. I'd heard it 100 times at work, through a stethoscope, on a stranger. I had never once heard it come out of my own son's chest in my mother's backyard, 6 feet from a table of hot dog buns. The yard went chaotic in the particular useless way a yard full of well-meaning people goes chaotic when nobody actually knows what to do. My father shouted for someone to bring water, as if water was going to be the thing that helped. An uncle suggested Benadryl, and just watching him for a minute, the exact wrong advice, delivered with total unearned confidence. My mother stood frozen with one hand over her mouth, saying Eli's name over and over, like saying it enough times might fix something on its own. I would replay every one of those reactions for months afterward, the specific, particular uselessness of each one, and none of them frightened me half as much as what happened next. Josh was patting his own pockets for his car keys instead of listening to a single word I was saying, some panicked instinct telling him, "Drive, drive, drive," when driving anywhere at that moment would have been the single worst thing either of us could have done. And Kayla, even then, even watching it unfold directly in front of her, said, "You're scaring him more than the cake did, Marin. Seriously." That was the moment I finally understood something about my family I don't think I'll ever be able to unlearn. It was never actually going to be the cake that convinced any of them of anything. Even watching it happen in real time, 6 feet away, they still needed someone else to tell them it was real before they'd let themselves believe it. I stopped trying to get anyone to understand. I just acted. I knelt down, told Eli in the calmest voice I had that Mommy was going to help him and it was going to feel like a quick pinch, and I administered the epinephrine into his outer thigh exactly the way I've shown this family a dozen times without a single one of them ever really watching. I called out, clearly, over the noise, for Josh to call 911 right now and to say the word anaphylaxis to the dispatcher so they'd send the right unit. I told my father to get everyone back, that Eli needed air and space, not an audience. I counted Eli's breaths out loud, both because I needed the number and because hearing my voice stay level seemed to be the only thing in that yard actually staying level. My hands, if you're wondering, did not shake. 11 years of doing this for strangers meant that when it was my own son on the ground in front of me, my hands already knew exactly what to do without asking my heart for permission first. The 4 minutes between the epinephrine and the sirens were the longest of my life, and I have worked holidays in a level 2 trauma center. I kept my hand flat against Eli's chest the whole time, not for any clinical reason left at that point, but because I needed to feel it rising and falling under my palm more than I needed almost anything else in the world just then. He looked up at me once, scared but already breathing a little easier, and asked in a small voice if he was in trouble. I told him no, baby. Never. Not for this. Not ever. And I meant it with everything I had left in my chest. The paramedics were fast, under 6 minutes, which in a county like ours is close to a miracle. I gave the lead medic a clean, complete handoff before he'd even fully knelt down. Time of exposure, time of first symptom, time and site of the epinephrine dose, current respiratory status, full allergy history. He looked up at me halfway through, something clicking into place behind his eyes, and said, "Cole? Charge Nurse Cole, County General." I told him yes. He nodded once, the way you nod at a colleague mid-shift, and the whole rhythm of the scene changed. He stopped explaining things to me the way he'd been explaining them to the rest of the yard, and started simply working alongside me instead, the two of us moving Eli onto the stretcher, in the kind of wordless coordination that only exists between people who've done this exact motion 100 times before, just never together, and never on someone either of us loved. I watched my entire family's faces do something in that moment I will remember for the rest of my life. A slow, visible recalibration, 11 years too late, of exactly who I was and exactly what I did for a living every single day that not one of them had ever bothered to ask me about. Eli was stable within the hour, watched overnight at the hospital as a precaution, and home the next afternoon, tired and a little clingy and completely, thoroughly fine. I want to be clear about that, because it matters. He was fine. But something in our family was not fine anymore, and I wasn't in any hurry to fix that particular thing. That night, a few of my own coworkers stopped by Eli's room, between their own patients. Nobody paged them. Word just travels fast in a department that small, and they wanted to see for themselves that he was really okay. My counterpart on the night shift brought me a coffee I hadn't asked for and sat with me for 10 quiet minutes while Eli slept, not saying much, just present the way we're both trained to be present for strangers a dozen times a shift. It was the first time in longer than I could remember that being surrounded by people who actually understood what I did for a living felt like being held up instead of having to explain myself. Sometime around 2 a.m, sitting in that hallway with the coffee gone cold in my hands, I finally let myself cry, not from fear anymore, since the fear had already passed hours earlier, but from something closer to relief, and something closer to grief for exactly how long I'd apparently been carrying all of this alone. Josh didn't say much on the drive home from the hospital the next day. Somewhere around the second stoplight, he reached over, took my hand off the gear shift, and just held it. He told me, quietly, that he was sorry it took watching our son almost stop breathing in front of him for him to actually hear what I'd been saying for 2.5 years. I told him I didn't need the apology nearly as much as I needed it to actually change something going forward. He said, and meant it, that it already had. I didn't yell at anyone that week. I didn't need to. A few days later, over coffee at my mother's kitchen table, I told her, evenly, that Josh and I would be pausing the insurance premium payment starting next month, that I needed to focus that money and that energy closer to home for a while. My mother's face did the same thing the paramedics had, just slower, the arithmetic of 11 years quietly rearranging itself behind her eyes. 11 years of being just Marin, and it turned out all it would have ever taken was one Tuesday afternoon and an ambulance in the driveway. I called Kayla separately, later that same week. I told her, as evenly as I could manage, that she wouldn't be alone with Eli again, not for a while, maybe not for a long while, until she could tell me, honestly, that she understood why that mattered. She started to say something about how she'd never actually meant for any of this to happen, and I believed her. I still do. I told her that not meaning it doesn't undo it, and that I needed her to sit with that longer than one phone call would allow before we talked about what came next. This isn't a punishment, I told her. It's just a fact about how things are going to be for a while. She was quiet for a second on the other end of the line, and then she said, quietly, that she understood. I don't know yet whether she really does, but for the first time in longer than I can remember, she didn't argue, and she didn't reach for a joke to get us both out of the discomfort of the moment. I think that's its own kind of answer. If you've spent years being the one who's too much, the one who reads every label twice and asks the extra question and gets the eye roll for it anyway, I want you to hear this the way I finally let myself hear it, sitting in a hospital hallway at 2 a.m. while my son slept safely down the hall. Your competence was never up for a family vote. Your years of preparation were never the same thing as paranoia, no matter how many people call it that to your face. Your caution was never the problem. It was the thing standing quietly between the people you love and the worst day of their lives, whether they ever thanked you for it or not. You are allowed to stop explaining yourself to people who only start listening once the ambulance is already in the driveway. You are allowed to protect your child louder than you protect everyone else's comfort at the table. I didn't destroy my family that 4th of July. I just stopped being the only thing quietly holding the whole afternoon together while everyone else got to relax. A few weeks later, at a much smaller, much quieter Sunday dinner, I watched my mother check the label on a jar of pasta sauce twice before she opened it, without me asking, without anyone reminding her. She didn't say anything about it. She didn't need to. And for the first time in a long time, I watched my son eat at a family table afterward, and I wasn't the only one checking the label first. So tell me honestly, if it had been your child, and the people who were supposed to help you froze instead, would you have let it go afterward, the way I almost talked myself into doing, or would you have drawn the same line I finally drew? I really want to know where you land. Thank you for watching. This story is fictional, written for reflection and entertainment. If you take one thing from it, let it be this. The people who call you dramatic for taking care of someone are very often the same people who will need you to stay perfectly calm the day it turns out you were right all along.